Welcome to the Scottish Rite Journal podcast, an audio presentation of the Scottish Rite Journal, brought to you by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction, Mother Supreme Council of the World. This week's article is Elliott Barker, Frontiersman, Conservationist, Mason, and Adoptive Father of Smokey Bear by Scott Jaquith, 32nd degree, KCCH, and comes from the September-October 2022 issue of the Scottish Rite Journal. Elliott Speer Barker was born in 1886 near Albany, Texas. Shortly after his third birthday, his family moved west to New Mexico Territory by covered wagon for the health of young Elliott's mother and in the hope of a more prosperous future. The Barkers ended up in the tiny Spanish-American village of Sapelo, west of Las Vegas, New Mexico, tucked up under the rugged eastern slopes of the Sangre de Cristo mountain range in a beautiful lush valley surrounded by dense forests of evergreen trees. It was here that the young Barker boy honed the outdoor skills that furnished Elliott and his family a splendidly fulfilling life, and one that would lead Barker to become the most storied game warden in New Mexico history. Self-reliance, tenacity, and an indomitable spirit seemed to be the only companions young Elliott Barker could rely on in his exploration of the Pecos River High country. It served him well throughout his life, and he often was hired as a fishing and hunting guide on many an outing for a wilderness visiting party. On one such trip, he met Ethel, whom Brother Barker married and who remained by his side for the rest of his life. Elliott Barker finished his high school education in 1905 and studied photography in Illinois. His uncle later hired him to work as a commercial photographer in Texaco, New Mexico. He spent the next 2.5 decades working in various roles as guide, forest supervisor, rancher, and manager for the privately owned Vermejo Park Ranch. During World War I, Elliott Barker was commissioned by the New Mexico National Guard as a first lieutenant and as marshal in the New Mexico Red Cross. The Great Depression years were hard in northern New Mexico, and out of necessity, Brother Barker sold the family ranch. Soon after, Elliott signed on as manager for the vast Vermejo Park Ranch near the border with Colorado and currently owned by media mogul Ted Turner. And in 1931, he was hired by the state of New Mexico as the state game warden, a position he held until 1954. By the time Elliott Barker became the state of New Mexico's chief game warden in 1931, the population of wild game in the state had been drastically reduced through overhunting and competition from domestic grazing animals. Brother Barker continued reintroduction efforts for big game animals, begun by private landowners and forward-thinking state game wardens, 20 years before he was hired as state game warden. Through a series of revolutionary conservation measures which have endured for nearly a century, the population of wild elk, deer, and Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep have not only recovered from extirpation, but also become the state of New Mexico's signature big game species. They have balanced out the natural ecosystem in the Southern Rockies and now provide the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish much-needed revenue for statewide conservation programs through the sale of hunting permits. Elliott Barker's legacy lives on today in the healthy herds of trophy deer, elk, and bighorn sheep that hunters stalk every late summer and throughout the fall in every mountain range, aspen grove, meadow, river bottom, and foothill in New Mexico. Elliott Barker beautifully captures the results of elk reintroduction in his beloved Sangre de Cristo Mountains in his 1953 memoir, Beatty's Cabin. During my trips to Beatty's Cabin country in 1931, 1932, and 1933, 15 years after the release had been made, much signed, and occasionally, a small band of elk were observed. What a warm satisfaction it is to know that restitution for the shame of extermination had at last been made. One of the most notable chapters in Elliott Barker's life occurred quite by accident when, in 1950, a black bear cub was found by another state game officer after a devastating fire in the Capitan Mountains of south-central New Mexico. The tiny cub with burned paws was adopted by Brother Barker, nursed back to health by him and fellow game wardens and their families, and delivered to the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. He became Smokey Bear, the living embodiment of 1940s fire prevention, and lived 26 years at the zoo as a living symbol for the care of our national forests and a reminder that only you can prevent forest fires. Elliott Barker joined Montezuma Lodge No. 1 in Santa Fe, New Mexico in the late 1940s and received the Scottish Rite degrees in 1950. It seemed that full-time employment as the state game warden precluded Brother Barker from dedicating much time to Masonic involvement, however keen his interest may have been. He remained a member in good standing of both organizations, as well as the local Santa Fe Shrine Club, for half a century, until his death in 1989 at age 103. Elliott Barker's life spanned nearly the entire 20th century, and he was truly a man of his time, as well as a man who saw far into the future as a conservationist. He lived a life of service and dedication to a purpose larger than himself. Brother Barker's greatest legacy may be the glorious wonder any wilderness traveler finds while exploring the stunning Pecos Wilderness High Country. Established in 1964 by an act of Congress and further expanded in 1980, the Pecos Wilderness looks very much the same as it did when 10-year-old Elliott first laid eyes on it at the end of the 19th century. No doubt that on any glorious New Mexico day, after a lifetime of management and enjoyment of New Mexico's natural resources, Brother Elliott Speer Barker could look upon his century of life and see that it had borne fruit even unto his later days. Those of us who have spent a moonless night under a star-spangled sky in the New Mexico wilderness, listening to elk bugling, watching a herd of mule deer glide silently through a sun-dappled aspen glade, or hearing the crash of bighorn sheep rams sparring on the edge of a mountain cliff, owe Brother Elliott Barker a sincere debt of gratitude. As an added feature to the Scottish Rite Journal podcast, I had the privilege to speak with Brother Scott regarding his article. Hope you enjoy it. I've been told that the real work in Freemasonry is done outside the lodge. How did Brother Barker exemplify this quality?
So I did a little bit of thinking about that one, and it was an excellent question. The thing that I thought was that back in that time period, late 1800s, self-reliance, there was no question about that. You had to be self-reliant, particularly if you were living on the frontier, and the Barker family was certainly living on the frontier. I wrote down that core values that I saw, that I read about Elliott Barker, he really exemplified self-reliance, courage, perseverance, and dedication. My thought was that Elliott Barker came to Freemasonry later in life, and he'd already formed this persona, if you will. It was all based on those values, and that he was really a solid, well-rounded man by that point in time. And what he did was he brought those to Freemasonry here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I think it was an easy transition for him. Right. And he met a lot of like-minded Masons here in Santa Fe, and he fit right in. And kind of a anecdotal story is that one of the brothers here, he is our lodge secretary in Montezuma Lodge. He used to still see Elliott Barker well into his 90s at Shrine. Yeah, still active, still participating. We'd go for breakfast and things like that by himself, meet with the guys. So I think it really spoke to him later, particularly later on in life, that the men that he was meeting, even though they may have been younger, may have been the same age, they held the same values that he held. I kind of elaborated on this, and if you don't mind if I kind of riff on it, just kind of
not at all.
Our slogan is "We make good men better." You may have heard that in your travels here, but I think that Elliott Barker, by the time he came to Freemasonry, or vice versa, Freemasonry came to Elliott Barker, however you want to look at it, he was already on a very solid foundation. He had already established himself as a man, as a professional, as an outdoorsman, husband, and father. He just developed everything that Freemasonry already had into kind of a fine art in his life. I think that's one of the things that I've noticed. You can't take that rough ashlar and make it a perfect ashlar overnight.
What kind of creative input with the Smokey Bear ad campaign did Brother Barker have?
Okay, so I looked into that. Brother Mark, when I submitted the article, he asked if I kind of not fact check, but check some of the details about the ad campaign and the Smokey the Bear cub that was found down in the Capitan Mountains. Mm-hmm. So I found, interestingly enough, that the Smokey the Bear advertising campaign started in 1944. 6 years later was when Smokey the Bear cub was found down in the Capitan Mountains. So it turns out that it was, over half a decade later when the cub was found. even though the Cub wasn't a direct part of the advertising campaign. With you see the campaign hat, you see him putting out forest fires with the pail of water and everything like that. I think that Elliott Barker had the kind of like the foresight to know that this Cub, sending the Cub to the National Zoo in Washington, would serve as a more poignant, important, and tangible, real symbol of the prevention of forest fires than kind of a marketing campaign ever could. I thought that was interesting and it may have been something that everyone was familiar with, throughout the Southwest, that these forest fires were so damaging that the Forest Service really wanted to put a halt to it. And I think that the guys seeing this as an opportunity to make this living symbol real for everybody who visited Washington, D.C. So it wasn't directly an influence on the marketing ad campaign, but certainly that bear who lived in the National Zoo for 26 years was the ambassador for prevention of forest fires to everybody who visited the zoo.
What kind of childhood did Brother Barker have, and who do you think shaped Brother Barker's beliefs in conservationism?
This was a great question. Reading Elliott Barker's books, they're essentially memoirs of his childhood and his developmental stage in life. I think that the thing that really spoke to me was his stories about his childhood here in New Mexico. And it was something like, I can imagine, I believe I wrote about it in the article that I wrote for the journal. His family moved from Texas to New Mexico because of his mother's health. And it's usually because of the dry air. I imagine the kind of man Elliott Barker would have been had he stayed in Texas versus the one who he developed into here in New Mexico. And I believe the foundation was laid when he came out here and had this undiscovered, untrammeled wilderness at his back door. And if you ever come out to New Mexico, the eastern flank of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains are dramatic. You are at the edge of the plains, and it's just a sea of grass for as far as the eye can see. I think that his father and his mother and his brothers enjoyed it because it was almost like a paradise to them. Their childhood, particularly Elliott's childhood, was filled with hunting, fishing, trapping, horseback riding, and just time out in the wilderness like we couldn't imagine. I think it was just part of it. Those were the formative years that developed him into this self-reliant man. I don't think you can really understate the impact that being on your own in the forest, probably with nothing more than your rifle, a couple of tools, fire-making equipment. If you could do that, if you could survive a week out in the wilderness like that, you were prepared for anything. So I think those are the things that made him the man that he became. And it developed into a love of wilderness that he translated into a career, but also gave back and really reinforced and really kind of shepherded into and hopefully a love that other people could enjoy as well. But your other question, I think it was probably his father was probably the man who did more for him than anyone else. And when I was thinking about it, I was writing this down. I don't know, because I didn't read anything about it, that he spoke directly about the conservation ethic that he may or may not have had. But I think at that time, it was probably very pragmatic. And the idea was probably a philosophy of waste not, want not. So his father probably sent him out there. They probably didn't have a whole lot. Take what you need and don't take any more. And I think that probably translated into something that he could understand throughout his life. There was other characters that he met throughout his life, local ranchers, local hunters. There was one character in there named, I think it was George Beatty. Mm-hmm. And that's of course, Beatty's Cabin is the take of his book. He would have met all these guys out there, and they lived off the land, and they hunted, trapped, and fished. And I'm sure he admired them like no one else. I think it was certainly his father that was probably the one who kind of formed his opinion on how to conduct yourself in the wilderness, and developed his conservation ethic later in life.
So do you know who owns any of his commercial photography, and how much photography centered around any of his work as a game warden?
Well, I was looking about and researching this, and commercial photography, I think the work that he did, I remember that it was, he'd worked for his brother-in-law for a time. He'd gone to school, and then he was working for a brother-in-law. That material is probably long gone. If it was ever credited, I don't know where it could be. It was probably portrait. It was probably local work. I think it was Texaco. That may have been gosh, I don't even know what kind of work they would have done down in that part of the state, but
Yeah.
it was probably just spotty work, maybe portraiture. I have no idea where that is.
Okay.
He did take a lot of photographs during his life, and a lot of photographs were taken of him throughout his life. I think the majority of the things that he used in his books were probably taken by professional photographers. There are numerous ones here in Santa Fe that owned studios that were either along for promotional purposes,
Mm-hmm.
or were part of his guiding trips up in the backcountry, horseback hunting and fishing, and they took a lot of fish and trophy pictures of him. The commercial material, like I said, I think it's long gone. The material that I used for the article, however, there are a few photographs at the Museum of New Mexico's Palace of Archives collection.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of the material I found was with the Department of Fish and Game, and they're right down the street from us. So the Department of Fish and Game must have a large collection of photographs with Elliott Barker, because it comes up frequently.
Right.
So somebody was on staff, I believe, taking photographs of Elliott Barker throughout his career at the state of Mexico for the Department of Fish and Game. So his career and his life is very well photographically documented.
So his wife, Ethel Barker, was she involved to any degree in what Brother Barker did professionally?
Yes. Not only was she, his wife, she was also must have been a friend, a great sport, and a lover of the outdoors. Otherwise, I don't think she could have stood.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing that I found was that Elliott met Ethel on a family pack trip. So he was taking the family out, Ethel's family out, and that's where he met her. Very young. They were both very young, and they were married for many, many decades. I don't know if Ethel worked for the Department of Fish and Game while he was working there, but she was certainly on a lot of the trips that he made for backcountry visitors, tourists, and the like, because he mentions that later on in the closing chapter of Beatty's Cabin, he mentions that he and his wife Ethel will be taking, I think it's his grandchildren out into the country. So they were advanced in years, and they were still out there taking trips together. So she was not only a good sport, but they were companions, and it seemed to be just a great pair, and they lived together. And I think that their life story is just a wonderful American love story. And I think that that Ethel, she must have been one heck of a woman, because at the time that they were married, and the difficulty that it must have been to raise a family here in New Mexico was no small task. So she must have been a really remarkable woman, and I really admire her ability to put up with so much. That's it. I think that it was amazing that I looked at Elliott Barker's obituary. He died at 101. I'm not sure how much younger she was than Elliott, but she was still alive and going after he passed away. Yeah, so they lived really long lives, those two.
And you were with talking about with everything that you said about Ethel, it was and how she was a good sport. She probably figured out fast, if I'm going to have any time with my husband, this is the time that it's going to be.
Indeed. And, I remember seeing a couple of photographs of her, fishing, and they were out there on horseback. So you're probably right. I don't think there was a whole lot of time with him at the house. So you're probably right that if they were going to be together, they'd have to be together out in the wilderness, out in the country.
Like and share this article, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you wish to comment, please leave one, and as a reminder, hit the notifications bell. Any accompanying photographs or citations for this article can be found in the corresponding print edition. The Scottish Rite Journal is published by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction, Mother Supreme Council of the World. Mark Dreisenstock, 32nd degree, KCCH, Managing Editor. I'm your host, Matt Bowers.